Cam, you're muted.
It's not a virtual event unless you find yourself muted. So I'll try this again. And good evening, friends, and welcome to our first Moton Author Series event of 2021, featuring Dr. Alfred Cobbs and his new memoir, Locked Out, Finding Freedom and Education After Prince Edward County Closed Its Schools. My name is Cameron Patterson, and I serve as Executive Director here at the Robert Russell Moton Museum. The Moton Museum is housed in Farmville, Virginia's former Robert Russell Moton High School, now a National Historic Landmark and Museum, focused on preserving and constructively interpreting the history of civil rights and education as it relates to Prince Edward County and the leading role our citizens played in moving America from segregation towards integration. In addition to the countless education programs built around our permanent exhibit, Moton School Story Children of Courage, we offer a number of public programs, including tonight's Author Series program. This series promotes authors whose work focuses on the history of America's civil rights movement and advances conversations throughout the year that includes a specific look at Prince Edward County and the leading role our citizens played. The series also focuses on societal issues that promote dialogue and advance positions that ensure empowerment within a constitutional democracy. Over the past year, we've been excited to welcome authors such as Shell Brown Henderson, Dr. Twitty Stiles, Mr. Ken Woodley, and the Honorable Henry L. Marsh. And so now it is my pleasure to introduce Ebony Lee, a member of our Moton Museum Council, who will offer an introduction of Dr. Cobbs. Ebony is the Assistant Vice President of Marketing for Benchmark Community Bank and serves as a member of our Moton Council, having served since 2019. Welcome, Ebony.
Good evening. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce my cousin, Dr. Alfred L. Cobbs. Dr. Alfred L. Cobbs is Associate Professor Emeritus of German Studies at Wayne State University, where he taught for 34 years. He holds a bachelor's degree from Berea College in Kentucky, a master's degree from the University of Missouri at Columbia, and a doctorate from the University of Cincinnati. Prior to his appointment at Wayne State, he taught at the Universities of Cincinnati and Virginia. During his career, he received 2 summer Fulbright Awards to Germany. He served as a reader for the Advanced Placement Test in German, as well as the Test Development Committee for AP German. During academic year 1995 to 1996, Dr. Cobbs was resident director of the Wayne State University Junior Year in Freiburg, Germany program, which consisted of a consortium of Wayne State University, the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and Michigan State University. His research and teaching interests include post-war German literature with an emphasis on German-American literary relations, literatures and cultures of minorities in the Federal Republic of Germany, literature and technology, and foreign language pedagogy. In 1984, he received the President's Award for Excellence in Teaching from Wayne State University. He is also the author of 2 books, The Image of America in Post-War German Literature, Reflections and Perceptions, and Migrants Literature in Post-War Germany, Trying to Find a Place to Fit In. In retirement, Dr. Cobbs likes to travel, read, visit culture venues in the city of Detroit, and have lunch or dinner with former students or colleagues. Now we welcome Dr. Cobbs to give excerpts from his works. Thank you.
Good evening. Guests who are listening to the interview virtually. Thank you for signing in and for joining us this evening. It's a real privilege to talk about this memoir. And I want to start by talking about the writing as a process and how the genesis of this book, this memoir, how I got into it. And I'm going to do some digression. And I hope when I'm done with the excerpts and that, and when the questions I asked at the end, that all of the threads will come together. The process of writing this memoir took a couple of years, but the birth of the book itself took more than 50 years. Why? A memoir is retrospective, introspective, and it has to have a perspective on one's life. So it can't be written at the beginning of one's journey. And it is a journey, this writing. The end of, one must have a perspective on one's life, where one has come from. If I were to rewrite or to write this memoir now, after I have written Locked Out, it would be a different book. Because what I've learned in the process of writing, and in the process of introspection, and in the process of this retrospective, I've come to find my inner self and to reconnect with my inner self in a way that I had not done earlier because of the trauma of the schools. Over the years, people have said to me, "You have an interesting story to tell. Why don't you write it down?" Well, it wasn't the time. I had to wait until my gut, till my psyche let me know it was time. I'm reminded of the verse from Ecclesiastes 3:1. There is a time for everything and a season for everything activity under heaven. When the time was right, the story would not let me go until I had started writing it, till I'd put it down. The impulse to write a story that possesses one psyche is something that I learned from Toni Morrison, and I'm not comparing myself to her, but when she was writing a novel, she talked about the novel getting hold of her and wouldn't let go until she put it down. I had that sort of feeling. And when I sat down to write my story, I realized there were two voices speaking to me. And then, of course, the professor in me wanted me to add a third voice, and that was snippets of civil rights history for folks who didn't know about the bus boycotts, the Freedom Riders, didn't know about the Brown versus Board of Education, and of course, the brutality of Reconstruction, starting right after 10 years after the Civil War when troops were withdrawn from the South. But let me come back to talk about these two voices. The voice with which I was negotiating my everyday world and articulated, and which I articulated what I wanted to say, that was the voice, one of the voices speaking. The other voice was my innermost being, my core, which had been bruised, intimidated, assaulted by the trauma I experienced when the school doors were shut in the fall of 1959. I was locked out. The second voice was sometimes muted, sometimes elusive, sometimes tentative, sometimes absent like a phantom. It had to be jogged from lethargy, had to be jogged from anguish. And sometimes it was put on ice to shield the pain, the anguish. My editor pointed this out to me when she read the manuscript for the first time and helped me to articulate this. She said that there are two voices, and I'm trying to negotiate which voice is speaking when. But a memoir is a dialogue or bridge or mediation between these two voices. As I was in search for myself, for my authentic self, for my inner self, in an effort to bring the two voices together. To finish my discussion on my memoir, I need to digress a bit. Please indulge me to set the stage and the background for its genesis. I hope that after the introduction, the excerpts I will read, and the questions by the moderator, it will come together for you. When the Board of Supervisors closed the public schools in the county in 1959, I was devastated. My self-image and my psyche suffered a major blow. I began to lose a sense of who I was and where I was going. I got derailed existentially. And then I left home and had these experiences that led me to become a professor of German. And I want to go through a bit of these experiences and how I negotiated them. High school, college, graduate school, teaching at the University of Virginia and Wayne State University. I'm going to talk about all of those because all of those were sort of chapters in my life which had their own sort of independence, if you will. And I had to find a way to bring them all together, which I ultimately did, and which the book helped me to do. I went to high school, was a segregated high school about 100 miles from where I grew up. And a family took me in. It was the principal's family. He was the principal of the high school, and he was my guardian. He and his wife were my guardians. When I came to the community, I felt like an outsider. I felt like an interloper. I felt like I didn't belong to the community, that I didn't really fit in. Why? Why I didn't fit in? I had no close acquaintances in the area. I lived with the principal's family under his eyes all the time. I was unsure of myself and my steps. And so I fled into academic excellence. And my time was spent being a student. I was the valedictorian of the class. I was popular, but I didn't know why I was popular. I was chosen as president of the junior class, and I went there in the 10th grade and the 11th grade, and vice president of the senior class. And I gave one of the commencement speeches. Now, in spite of all of these things, I still felt like an outsider, that I didn't really belong to the community. And I gave my commencement speech, and I left the area and went away to college. And I thought, well, I finished that chapter. In the meantime, this inner self that was muted was on ice, so to speak. And then I went away to college, to Berea College, where I felt totally alienated at first. I'd never lived with whites socially and faced racial differences on campus. There were only about 20 Black students. We had no special support system on campus for Blacks. I was a loner. I didn't know how to negotiate that world. I was intimidated. I was not included in many activities of campus life. I found refuge in German. Why? I had majored in math and had done it very successfully. And I came to Berea and had trouble with calculus for reasons I won't go into, in physics. And I thought about dropping out. And I thought, I can't do that because of the Vietnam War, and I would be snapped up as cannon fodder. And I have to find a way. So I took German as a language requirement at age 19, an area of study which I excelled because it had Latin in high school. And I'd found a professor and his wife, both professors, who believed in me. And I was sorely in need of somebody who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. And I found a comfort in studying German where I could function reasonably well. I found my equilibrium. Here I was, a student excelling, one of the best in the class, raising both hands to recite. And I was better than a lot of the white students, a couple of them from Virginia. And they asked me to teach German as a student assistant. And I said, well, and to teach German later in college or junior college and that. And I said, why should I teach German? Black folks aren't interested in German. And this was in 1969. And they said to me, teach white folks then. And I started as a teaching assistant explaining German concepts that students were having problems with, and I could do it well. And I understood, and I thought, kid, you can do this. And so, as I said, I found a refuge in my equilibrium there. And I stayed with that until I got my degree. And my family wondered what was wrong with me, because what was I going to do with it? But my parents never discouraged us from doing something which we were good in. And then I went to the University of Cincinnati for graduate study. And that was I was in my 20s. I was happy for the first time after the schools closed. I found fulfillment for the first time since the closing of schools. But in a strange way, this was a kind of an artificial world to me, because German was the major language used. Lots of the students were from Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, and lots of them were immigrants. I felt at home. I felt fully accepted as a person. Why? I was conversant in the language, which was what everybody was speaking in the department and on campus. And I was familiar with the culture. And I was an outsider, though, who felt like an insider, except as an insider, because I knew the language and the culture. I was an insider because of my knowledge of the language and culture. And I fit in, and I rarely ventured outside of the department in those 5 years. We had a softball team, a young faculty. We had lots of parties and lots of departmental things, symposia, and that kind of thing. And so this was a form of self-alienation, if you will. It was a period in which I put my wounded self-image on ice for that period. I could function well. And then I went to the University of Virginia with my first job after Cincinnati. And as one of my colleagues from Barbados, who was in religious studies department with a Harvard PhD, said, "This is the plantation. Cobbs, we on the plantation." And I did feel some of that anguish and some of that ugly stuff that I had left Virginia to try to avoid. But I still felt a sense of satisfaction and an existential equilibrium. So I did that anguish that I was suffering didn't totally disappear, and it didn't totally go on ice, but it was manageable, as I said. And I found joy in teaching German. And then my other support was I had family in the near area, in Lynchburg, in Hampton, in Washington, in Baltimore, in Prince Edward County. So when I needed to get away from the university, I could put my feet on the ground and return to family. This was wonderful. And I was back on home turf again. But then I didn't get tenure at the University of Virginia. And I went to Wayne State University, to an urban university in a setting in an inner city that was coming out of the race riots of 1968. A city that was mostly Black, with a Black mayor and a population that was mostly Black, and a faculty that was mostly white, and I felt totally alienated in Detroit. I was most unhappy. And this anguish and this pain returned. It raised its ugly head again in the ice that had melted, so to speak, and my self-image that had been put on ice came back with great destructive power. I was unhappy. I was at my lowest point. I felt alone. I felt isolated. I was shaking in my belief that I was an excellent teacher, although I'd heard that at the University of Virginia and had gotten corroboration from students. The students felt that I was surly and that I didn't care about them and it was too difficult. I had trouble reconciling the group of students at Virginia, some of the best that I've ever had in my career, and those at Wayne State that were first generation in their family, that had very delicate skins. And who took criticism very badly. And so I had to learn to deal with that. And so in this depression and this pain, I had stomach pains, and I had a wound to break out on my thumb area of one of my hands, and it got worse. And I thought, what do? I can't negotiate this. I can't. I came home and sort of found refuge at home, but lonely, no friends, nobody to reach out to except family. And I'd call them, and they were distant. And so I believe there were two guardian angels who came to my rescue. One of them was an Afro-American professor in the School of Social Work who referred me to a psychological social worker. And I went to him, and when we talked, he quoted to me Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book, Death and Dying, The Stages of Death and Dying. And he said, you have gone through a period of death and dying psychologically, and you have lost your bearings, and you must find a way back. Otherwise, it'll take its toll. It'll spiral down and down. And so he said, I want you to go here when you leave and get some medication to put on the topical. But he said, you have to deal with this. It's a psychic, it's an internal problem. It's a problem that you have to deal with. It's a psychic wound. And it won't heal unless you do something about the cause. I was shaken even more. And then I came back to the department and I did my teaching, but I remained unhappy. I remained lost. I remained full of despair. And if my self-image was not broken or not shattered, it was badly broken and bruised again. And it was hurting. One of my colleagues who could read my unhappiness, read the unhappiness on my face and in my body language without me saying anything, often invited me to lunch because he was worried about me, my fragility, existentially, psychically. Once at lunch, he shared with me that he had bone marrow cancer and had a 50-50 chance of survival if he had the transplant at the Mayo Clinic. He shared with me that he was talking to a psychiatrist about his death. And he said to me, anything that you can do to ease this pain and this anguish and to come to terms with it, you must do it. If you need to visit a psychiatrist, do so. And he gave me the name of that psychiatrist. But I was reluctant to go to him. He was in Detroit. I didn't want anybody at the department or at the church where I was in the choir to know that I was doing psychological counseling. And so I drove to Ann Arbor, about an hour away, twice a week, to the Life Stress Center and paid my own bill to talk to a psychiatrist. And I joined a group. I joined a group session with a psychiatrist and a psychological social worker. And they pointed me to some mechanisms that I could use to come to terms with this anguish. And I found my equilibrium again at Wayne State and remained teaching there, where I threw myself into my work and where I sang in the church choir and became the librarian and threw myself into dealing with all of that. And so I found a way of dealing with this anguish and this pain, of putting it on ice again. And then after I retired, after 34 years, and came home, I had a lot of time to do a lot of introspection and a lot of reflection about my life and where I was and how I'd gotten there, and coming to terms with it and finding my way back to my inner self, to my core, to the person that I really had become, so that I could be fully integrated It really was picking up the pieces and putting them together again. And so now I'm ready to read to you some excerpts about how this started and how these ideas that came into my head, and how I started writing them down and what it finally became. So I'm ready to read the first excerpt from chapter 1, which is hope and inspiration, because I felt hope and inspiration after I'd had a successful career as a professor of German, and I had survived with my equilibrium intact, and I was finding my way back to myself, to my inner core, to my inner being, to find peace, looking for peace and happiness that had eluded me for 50 years. So I'm going to talk about getting away, going to Berea College, and I didn't know what I was getting into, and how I missed the bus literally as I was making my way to this college. And this is based on what discrimination did, and based on what came out of Reconstruction, why I had to deal with this situation. Okay, I'm beginning on page 1. My brother gunned the Dodge Ford Drive to 85. My other brother laid on the horn. We had never driven even a mile over the speed limit, but were flying at 20 over that day, trying to trace down the Greyhound bus that had left me at the colored-only ticket window in Farmville, Virginia. I sat in back on the lookout for police. I can't explain why we arrived late at the Greyhound bus terminal in Farmville on that particular day, because Daddy had always taught us to arrive at the station early whenever we traveled. He felt strongly that if you arrived ahead of schedule for an appointment, you would never be late. Because of our late arrival, I missed the first leg of the 12-hour bus trip that would take me from Farmville to Charleston, West Virginia, and from there to Lexington, Kentucky, and finally to Berea, Kentucky, my final destination. There I would begin my freshman year at Berea College, whose motto is God has made of one blood all the peoples of the earth, from the book of Acts. It was this principle on which Berea defended its belief in interracial education when it was founded in 1855, 10 years before the Civil War, in a border state sympathetic to the Southern cause, a few years before the outbreak of the Civil War. Now I'm going to move to the closing of schools. It comes from the chapter 4, which is called The Impending Storm, about the closing of school and its announcements, and how my brothers and I, Freddie and Samuel, whom I talk about in the book, who were impacted by this as well, this school closing. It was the end of summer. The last heat wave was upon us, and there were intermittent late afternoon thunderstorms, as was normal. However, late August was not only the time of the summer slow waning, it was the time for spiritual revivals at the country churches and for schools starting in a few weeks. Therefore, we were savoring the last days before the school term would begin. My brothers, Samuel and Freddie, and I were good students and loved going to school, and always looked forward to the opening day. In late August and early September of that year, rumors of dark clouds appearing on the political horizon began to circulate. If we had been clairvoyant or had a crystal ball, we might have had some inkling of what was happening. However, our excitement and anticipation dampened in summer 1959 when the announcer on the local radio station reported that the Prince Edward County Board of Supervisors had voted not to approve funding for the public schools in the county for the academic year 1959-1960, rather than be forced by the liberal bureaucrats in Washington and the U.S. Supreme Court to desegregate the schools. But on the first day of school, the buses did not roll. We thought that it was a power play on the part of the Board of Supervisors in the county to flex their muscles, to show that they had the power to frustrate the efforts of the Supreme Court order to desegregate the schools of the county with all deliberate speed. Being naive and not schooled in the ways of Southern segregationists, my siblings and I assumed that schools would reopen in a few days, or at least in a few weeks. So we were happy to have a bit of an extended summer vacation. But that first day turned into days, the days into weeks, the weeks into months, and eventually the months into years, 5 to be exact. It began to dawn on us that we had been confronted with the cruel reality that we and countless other Black students in the county had lost the opportunity for public education, despite the fact that the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Virginia was supposed to guarantee a public education to all of its school-age citizens, regardless of race or class. Now I want to move to talking about the study of German and how that helped me to and how my mother played a pivotal role in making sure that the last 3 of us, got an education. In the South, in Black families, the mothers and grandmothers were the matriarchs. They usually dealt with the schooling of the children, and it was their responsibility. And so my mother felt a great need to take care of this, and she did, probably against my father's protest, who was a farmer and needed us to help him raise the crop. After all, he was in his 60s and had had heart attack. And we did a lot of farming because we sharecropped and we only got half of what was earned. So this is about my mother and her faith in finding schooling for us and making sure that we would not lose out. When the public schools in Prince Edward County were closed in 1959 rather than desegregate, Mama stepped bravely into the darkness, grasping a candle and extending it to her family, making the decision that the last of her 3 children would finish high school, whatever it took. We never knew how much discussion she and Daddy had about the whole situation. Daddy was the breadwinner in the family, and as a farmer in his mature years was probably less sanguine about educational possibilities for us and held a more immediate and pragmatic perspective. He saw the leaving home of his last boys as a threat to his ability to manage the farm chores, which were labor intense and required many hands, especially given that he was almost 60 and already suffered a heart attack. Be that as it may, in the course of the next 4 years, my 2 brothers, Samuel and Freddie, and I had secured places to continue our education because of Mama's persistence and insistence on her dream. Mama had kept this dream alive because she had already seen 7 of her 10 children receive their high school diplomas and wanted to see all of us do so. Eventually, 8 of the 10 of us would go on to receive college degrees. Now, the next passage I want to read is one about studying German and how that was at Berea and how that was sort of my salvation. As I talked about in my introduction, I went off to college in search of myself, or perhaps something which I could believe in. Despite my dreams of excelling in school and achieving my goals, having been derailed by a character named Jim Crow, who had been created during the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, the boogeyman Jim Crow stood between me and my dreams. I became hell-bent on defeating him through achievement. I would make both Black and white proud of me through my accomplishments. In spite of all of these obstacles set before me, I was shaken from this internal lethargy on campus one day when I heard the words, Muska says that you're very good in German. Have you thought about majoring in German? Chris Kogema, a professor of German at Berea, greeted me with those words one day in fall semester 1963. Remember, I was 19 years old, the age. I wondered why this white person with one of the sunniest dispositions I'd ever known was showing a personal interest in me. His words certainly filled a personal deficit and an existential need that I'd felt in the years so since I'd been studying on campus. Given the closing of public schools in Prince Edward County, the disruption of family and community life it caused, and the question of whether I would get an education at all, and then living with the host family and adhering to their rules to get an education, I didn't know quite where I was or who I was. I was struggling to find myself in a world of mostly white folks, with whom I shared no real life experiences. I had come to Berea looking for something that would presumably help me bridge the racial divide which had characterized my existence and that of other families in the community, something that would aid me in coming to terms with my potential hate of all white folks, because in my mind, they, all of them, had done this to me. Sorry. They had blocked my route to an education, to a bright future where I could realize my full potential as a person. Through it all, in coming to terms with my value system, my father had taught my siblings and me that one had to treat a person by the way they treated you, whether the person was black or white. It was the golden rule right out of Pauline theology. From my perspective, this was a hard lesson to learn at the time. And then I returned to the University of Virginia, and I want to read an excerpt about an encounter with a white student who was a very innocent encounter, but it shows how racism raised its ugly head, and that this anguish and this pain and this bitterness was still there. And I had to come to terms with it. So that was the ugly head that I talked about, raised itself a little in Virginia again, and I had chips on my shoulder. It does not surprise me in retrospect that encounter with a young white male student from the South would upset my equilibrium and cause the experience of past racism to raise its ugly head. One day at the end of my beginning German class, one of my best students, a young blonde fellow from Alabama, came up to me and asked me if I was native German. Given my physical appearance and the fact that I was back in, I'm sorry, although I'm fair-skinned, I looked nothing like a German. Given my physical appearance and the fact that I was back in the Commonwealth of Virginia, I took umbrage to the inquiry and asked him, "Do I look like a German to you?" I realized then that the chip I had on my shoulder because of the experience of racism in Virginia was still there, that I was still shaping my new self with a piece of the puzzle that had been missing since the time of the public schools closing in Prince Edward County, and most likely repressed during the time I spent outside the state. I had come full circle, looking at myself in the mirror of the past, and could not see beyond that point in time. It turned out that this student was from a well-to-do Southern family of means and privilege, but he harbored not one iota of racism. He had been born and raised in Alabama during the civil rights movement of the 60s and had been sensitized to the problems and challenges of race relations in the South. Rather than taking a defensive posture, the young man remarked that my German sounded like that of native Germans, whom he had heard speaking when his family had gone on a European trip. And the next chapter is a very painful one. and a bitter one, and I might shed some tears. If I do, would you forgive me? But I have to read this because it's a tragedy about the professors of German who got me into German. Sorry. Let me have a moment to regather my emotions. Thank you. And of course, I'm writing this memoir after I retired. And as I said, it's a retrospective, it's introspective, and of course, it's a perspective on the past. At the end of a happy and fulfilling career, and a life filled with joy and many rewards, there are moments of wistfulness. There are moments of wistfulness for those professors of German at Berea, the Kogemers, who helped me find my way, but had their lives cut short. Suffering a fate more terrible than what might have befallen them at the hands of the Nazis and the Russians. In an ugly stroke of irony, they came to their demise at the hands of their own blood. One of their 24-year-old twin sons murdered them in 1975 when they were in their early 50s in the prime of life. The terrible incident took place on Mrs. Kogemer's 52nd birthday. Now and then I still have sobering thoughts when I think about the fact that the Kogemers invested their time, their energy, and their love in someone's son who was lost and needed help finding his way and his equilibrium. Sorry. Yet, they could not help to save their own wayward son from himself and a world of darkness and mental distress that would lead him to commit such a dastardly act. I knew him as a loving and bright child and have never been able to fully come to terms with it. That was hard, very hard. The next chapter will probably, that's not one that's going to make me cry, but it is one that will show you that I've gotten stronger, and that I had grown from the Wayne State experience, and I've gotten stronger at the University of Virginia. I didn't. Wait a minute. Okay, sorry. Okay. At the University of Virginia, I was at the University of Virginia 5 years, and I didn't get tenure. I didn't get a permanent position, and I was let go. And I could have had a 6th year of grace, but I was hoping, and my colleagues were hoping I would get a job in my 6th year. And I did. And the chair of the department decided to ask a colleague behind my back to take over when I left, and told him he could use all the materials I had developed without my permission. And this was unacceptable to me and led to a confrontation with him and showed me some inner strength. Showed that I had some inner strength, and it was a period of growth in retrospect, I realized, even though it was a moment, but we process moments, pregnant moments, and they become moments of growth over time. after they didn't give me tenure. And then I start with, to add insult to injury, that 6th year at Virginia, the chair of the department, without my permission and without speaking to me directly, asked one of the tenured colleagues to take over my duties when I left and promised him that he could use the teaching materials I had developed. Because that colleague and I were not on the best of terms, he also did not discuss the issue with me. He too acted in a disrespectful and cowardly way and went to my teaching assistants behind my back and asked them for the material. Having developed a sense of loyalty to me over the course of our working relationship, the teaching assistants came to me and asked what they should do. I told them that under no circumstances should they give the colleague the materials. If he wanted to use them, he should come to me and ask my permission. This all led to a confrontation between the chair and me, in which I asserted my dignity and defended my integrity, 2 qualities I will never allow anyone to take from me. On that, there's no compromise. Power and wealth I may never have, but dignity and integrity I will carry with me to the grave. The chair tried to use the power of the office to coerce me into giving in to his requests and expectations by trying to censor me in front of my colleagues at a German area faculty meeting. At the meeting, he presented the case as a hypothetical one involving a conflict between 2 colleagues and expressed his view on the matter. Things backfired on him, however, as other colleagues expressed different perspectives. Things backfired on him, however, as other colleagues expressed different perspectives. Enraged, the chair asked me to come to his office after the meeting and began to castigate and threaten me with words to the effect that he could ruin my career. My dander was now up. My dignity was at stake, and my integrity was challenged. After he had said his piece, I, now in a state of rage, let him know in no uncertain terms that he could not ruin my career because my life did not depend on my having a career as a professor of German. In fact, when I was in the tobacco fields of Virginia and when the schools closed, it was not even on the horizon as a possibility. The power of the Holy Spirit, the power of God, helping us find our way, amazing grace, which I use in the book as a leitmotif of sorts. In that moment, he was incredulous and opined that I had misunderstood his intent. I was no fool. I had prevailed. In that moment, I knew who I was, from where I'd come, and where I was headed. And then slowly I'm getting to the end. I just have a couple more passages. I want to talk about reconciliation in Virginia 50 years later. After having a successful career and coming back to Virginia to celebrate a couple of milestones, and that was the dedication of the Virginia Civil Rights Memorial on the Capitol grounds in Richmond, Virginia, the first memorial to Blacks in the Commonwealth of Virginia on the Capitol grounds, and even in the state of Virginia, even though Blacks had been in Virginia for 400 years. Jamestown, 1607, there were Blacks already there. Long before slavery raised its ugly heads and the Europeans came up with the classification of race. And so I was there for the opening of that museum, that monument, a memorial. And on the same evening in Farmville, Virginia, where the strike took place, the Board of Supervisors in 2008 did a service of reconciliation and put a plaque on the courthouse lawn apologizing for the behavior of their predecessors, who were all white, of course. It was an integrated group now with blacks and women. And they put put a light in the cupola of the courthouse, a permanent light, a light of reconciliation. And they had a banquet to celebrate all of this. And so on the same day, I experienced these two events. And it was one moment of epiphany, and of course I have another that I'll talk about, but that was a moment of epiphany of sorts. Things were coming together. I could see from where I had come. Okay, so I'm at that passage now. Okay. And this is talking about the events in Richmond to celebrate the Virginia Civil Rights Memorial on the Capitol grounds, the capital of the Confederacy during the Civil War. And Farmville, Virginia, the hotbed of massive resistance and diehard racism, one of the hardest in the South. So I'm reading about how my reaction to all of this and the emotions I felt. And this was digging up some of this anguish and some of this pain and looking for reconciliation and looking for a way back to finding my way to my inner core, to my inner being, and to find peace. As I witnessed the events taking place in Farmville that day, the flow of tears and the outpouring of emotions seemed to find no end. I had found the catharsis that I had naively hoped to find in the delivery of the persuasive speech to the members of my small speech class at my liberal arts college in Kentucky in 1965, but could not because the scar was more than superficial. It was a gaping wound. Now I know why the butterfly has come to take on symbolic meaning in my life. It is as if I had been in a bound state of cocoon, both psychologically and emotionally for 50 years. And this experience afforded me the opportunity to free myself from it, spread my wings and move freely and with the lightness of a butterfly. Despite my personal metamorphosis, ongoing since 1959, I'm as clear-eyed as ever that racism has not disappeared from the fabric of the nation, for it is part and parcel of its DNA. But I feel positive that on that day in Prince Edward County, a group of people made at least a small tear in that fabric and decided to move forward together, beginning a new day with renewed hope and confidence. And the last passage I want to read is from chapter 14, which I call Coda, the Journey Back. And I'm not going to read a lot from that, but it really pulls three strands of my life together, which I viewed as separate entities. The high school experience in South Hill, which I felt like an outsider, and I didn't belong, and I had trepidation going back. The second was coming to the museum to celebrate the anniversary or the commemoration of 3 events that happened to me and to the kids who were caught in the strike. But I'd never felt that the museum was my museum, the museum about my story. I had kept a distance. I had come home over the years when I was at the University of Virginia and when I moved to Detroit. but I never really felt at home. I didn't have a graduating class from the high school. I didn't have a cohort of people that I kept in touch with. I didn't have a series of friends from there. And so I felt like an outsider there also. But when I came to that event, which marked the 50th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, 1954, it also was a commemoration of the 55th anniversary of the closing of schools in the county, 1959. So they closed them 5 years after Brown gave its decision to desegregate with all deliberate speed. And the third commemoration was the opening of schools in 1964, the second lawsuit, Griffin versus Prince Edward County, where the federal government, the federal judges ruled that they had to open the schools. And so schools were opened then. And so that was the second anniversary. That was the second thread of my life where I felt disjointed or I didn't belong. It wasn't about my story. And one of the events in that three-pronged celebration, or it wasn't a celebration of observation, commemoration, was an open forum at the museum. And one of the questions asked to the audience was, what impact does the museum have on your life? How do you think that the museum reflects what you went through? Those kinds of questions. And I had a moment of introspection. And I'm sitting there with my brother Freddie and his wife Patty. And I'm feeling things percolating in my gut. And I feel this anguish and this emotion bubbling up in me. Oh, I think I shouldn't say anything. I don't know what to say. And my sister-in-law Patty said, get up and say it. And so I got up and the words started flowing. And in that moment, that also was a moment of epiphany. I realized it was my museum. It was a museum about my story. And that came to that realization when I realized that the visit back to I did the first commemoration, visit back to my high school commemoration. Easton High School had been in existence 50 years, although it had closed in they had desegregated schools, and so the Easton High School became a middle school with a different name about 10 years after I graduated. So I was going back to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the founding of that school in 1953. And at that, and I had real trepidation. I didn't want to go. And I thought the impetus for that was a call from my high school counselor and his wife, who he was in his early 90s, she in her 80s, and they had been mentors for me in high school, and I was wanting to see them, and they said they were going and I should send in my registration. So reluctantly I did, and I thought, I won't go. If I don't feel like going, I won't go. And with a lot of trepidation, I decided to go. And there were two events. There was a picnic on Friday evening and a banquet and a speaker on Saturday night and a dance. And I thought, I can't go to the banquet. I don't know anybody. I don't have any connections. Whom am I going to sit with? I'm an outsider. I'm an interloper. So I'd have to go to the picnic. And I went to this picnic. And I was received warmly by people who didn't even know me, people who had attended that school. And slowly students came who knew me and who had chosen me as class president in my junior year and as class vice president in my senior year. They knew I was the valedictorian and gave one of the valedictory speeches. And they remembered events and they remembered my name and they remembered me in the community and that I lived with the principal. And I started recognizing faces and names, and people started sharing experiences. And I thought, gee, I do belong. And so that came in play when I was at the museum, and I thought, gee, we're all in the same boat. I belong in both of these communities. It's about all of us. Black folks have suffered the brunt of racism, whether you're in Prince Edward or Mecklenburg County or wherever you are in the South or in America. And I felt solidarity with them. And so two threads of this tapestry had come together. Because since I had retired, I had been working on coming to terms with my past. And then there was the opportunity to go to the celebration of my 50th graduating class from Berea. Now, I told you at Berea I was totally alienated, and I found refuge in German. And my German professors had been murdered and I didn't have any real close friends from Berea, that I was a loner, and that I had difficulty at first building bridges to white folks because I didn't have social training. I didn't have the social experience. And so I go back with a lot of trepidation. And on the day before I leave, I get an email from the youngest son of my German professors, who's a social worker down in Georgia, in Athens. And he touches base, and I'm devastated. And I think I haven't come to terms with his parents' death. And so I thought, I'm going back to Berea with a lot of trepidation, still alienated, still not feeling at home, and still trying to come to terms with the death of my mentors in German who had died at the hands of their son, who had suffered death through this heinous crime. And I thought, oh my goodness. Then I wrote an email to the son, and I went to this graduation with all of these emotions churning. And so I went back. Part of while I was there, I went to the cemetery alone and made my peace with my German professors and had my cry and had my journey back to my past. And then I went to Union Church on Sunday, and the campus minister did a sermon which touched me greatly. It is from Acts 17:28, for in God we live and move and have our being. So I'm going to read that, and then I'm just about done with reading. I'm with my excerpts. The events planned for the 3-day weekend of the 1966 class reunion at Berea awakened in me much more than I ever could have imagined. The weekend culminated with a sermon given by Reverend Gail Bowman, at the time director of the college's Willis Weatherford Religious Studies Center, at the Union Church on campus. Her sermon, Move Immovable Moved, based on Acts 7:28, for in God we live, move, and have our being, spoke directly to me and revealed to me how God had moved in my life since I entered Berea College as a frightened, confused, and racially traumatized freshman in 1962. In response to Reverend Bowman's sermon and how it had helped me to see, quotation marks, the role that Berea had played in it, I wrote her the following. And this was my epiphany. This was where I pulled it all together. I came home on a different plane, an ethereal plane, at peace with myself, having found serenity, I had found the reconciliation in Virginia. I found peace and serenity here. I found reconciliation in 2008, peace and serenity in 2016. I'm quoting me. My returning to Berea for the 50th class reunion last weekend was an emotional and spiritual high for me. So when I came to Union Church on Sunday morning for service, I was already on that plane. Your sermon and the music moved me even higher and onto an ethereal plane. They were most stimulating in every sense of the word. The sermon was an intellectual high for me and spoke directly to me in so many ways in terms of the movement of things in my life since the beginning of the Berea experience a bit more than 50 years ago. The movement of my own spirit and the movement of God's spirit in my life. What I experienced was the meshing of the emotional, the spiritual, and the intellectual in a way that I never could have imagined had I not attended the reunion of the class. I was blind, but now I see. And now I want to go back to just a couple of excerpts from the Coda, The Journey Back, chapter 14, the book where I pull the threads together. All journeys back's a paradox. All journeys back are paradoxically journeys forward, for they connect present with past by unearthing memories and experiences that make us into the people we are today. They are matrices, if you will, onto which the threads of our lives and personhood are woven. 3 journeys back to my past have been pivotal to my pulling together those major threads of how I, Alfred Leon Cobbs, overcame the odds, persevered, achieved a great deal in life, and made my contribution to society, despite the fact that the odds seemed against me. And then the last one is just a couple of sentences, and then I'm done. The 3 journeys back to my past have helped me gather the significant threads of my life into an existential tapestry. And I can now come to terms with the trauma of the Prince Edward County tragedy. In the process of writing my story, I have learned that the individual can triumph over adversity if the conditions are favorable. Thank you for indulging me and for listening. Now I'm ready for questions from the moderator.
Well, thank you, sir. You have said it often throughout the book that each of us has a story to tell, regardless of the path of our lives, and it is shaped by our individual and collective experiences. And what a journey you've taken us on. It is a journey of discovery, about overcoming those dark days, those dark moments, reconciliation, and finding that inner peace. So I'm very grateful that you have shared this with us.
Thank you.
I think, I was telling you earlier as I'm reading the book, what you come to appreciate is that some of the events and moments that you talk about in the earlier portions of the book, you really come to appreciate them even more as you learn, as we continue the story about the importance of relationships in your life. And I think those relationships manifest themselves with the relationship that you have with your brothers, particularly Samuel and Freddie, the relationship that you have with your parents, and the relationships that you formed throughout your academic career. And so I love the story of that opens chapter 1 about gunning the Dodge fluid drive up to 85. You sitting in the back looking out the window, trying to make sure that there are no cops as you guys are flagging down a Greyhound bus. And what that shows me is that, your brothers were just committed to making sure that you were going to get that bus and make your way to Berea College. And so talk about the relationship with your brothers, and talk about the impact on that relationship as schools close and you all have to go your separate ways for this moment in time?
I'm happy to do that. We had a wonderful relationship as children. And in the first two chapters, I talk about it until there are a couple of tragic things. Um, I talk about it, but we were always very, very close. Three Musketeers, and I was the middle boy, and they would pick on me. They used to say, "You think you know everything." And I guess I did. They told me later, that's why you're the professor. You became a professor. In any case, we had a wonderful relationship. And when that happened, we were in a tobacco field cutting tobacco, and we got the news that day on the radio at lunch that the schools would not open. The supervisors wouldn't provide the funds. And a Canadian journalist came into the tobacco field and said to us, "How do you feel? What do you think?" And little Freddie said, it'll be disrupt our education. It'll be a disadvantage for us. It won't be good." But we didn't take we didn't take the journalist quite so seriously because we could not believe that it would happen. And when we realized it was real, we didn't know what to do. And I quoted Mama because Mama was just devastated. Daddy was too, but he kept it to himself. And so we entered tobacco field again at my uncle's place, harvesting tobacco. And the home economics teacher and another teacher come up to the tobacco field and say, "Mr. Cobbs, a family over in South Hill, Virginia, in a segregated school in Mecklenburg County. In fact, the principal's family is willing to take a child from Prince Edward County and let the child live with them and get an education." And of course, there was no time for deliberation and for choosing straws and that kind of thing. And so I said, "I'll go," and didn't give Samuel and Freddie a chance to say anything. I feel a little bit sheepish about that even to this day. They've never said anything about it. They've never felt any kind of. And I felt badly because I thought, I'm leaving them and neither one of them will get schooling. And I will, but I'll be away from them. And those were the years of puberty and high school and those formative years. And I thought, we'll lose that time together. And it was devastating to think about it. And then, and Samuel, they both stayed out for the first year because they didn't find placement. And they were kind of bored. And, we didn't have TV because Daddy said we can't afford it. So we poor folks, TV was a luxury for folks who were sharecroppers and raised tobacco. And so Samuel and Freddie sort of passed their time working for white farmers as laborers and, just passing the time, really. And then the American Friends Service Committee came into the county and sponsored a program where they sent kids away to school who had 1 or 2 years left, three some, to get a high school diploma, placing them with white and black families up north and in the Midwest. And Samuel was sent to Morristown, New Jersey, and was put in Morristown Friends School, and with the first black to integrate the school in its 168-year history. And he felt trepidation at first, but he made his peace with himself, but uncomfortable, really. And being away from him, and we were very good friends, and little Freddie was, he still didn't, they both stayed out a year. And then the second year, Freddie didn't get a placement either. So 2 more years, and then the Arlington School County School Board, or one of the high school, sent some teachers down in the summer to do enrichment programs at churches. And they were to find a couple of students that families were willing to take in their homes in Arlington, Virginia. And a family took Freddie in for 2 years. But all of us were separated from each other, and it was extremely painful. And we only got to see each other like at Christmas or Easter, we didn't see each other often. So, and we didn't have cell phones and texting and that, and telephone. You paid for telephone calls, so we really had no communication, and we were alienated from each other. I mean, that's what it did as well. I mean, this sort of racism alienates you from each other, and we were with each other. We had to find common ground, which we had, of course, but that was difficult. That was very difficult, and we had to build back those relationships after things got better. And I really started building them back when I went to the University of Virginia. That was one of the pluses. Samuel and his wife Sadie lived in Hampton, and Fred and his wife lived in Lynchburg. And so I spent a lot of time with them, and they came to visit me. And so we worked on cementing, rebuilding those relationships, and they have lasted now. They're stronger than ever. But we had to rebuild them, and that's the damage of racism. One of the many things it does is to drive people apart and alienate them from each other. And so, that was hard. That was extreme. And writing the book, I felt I had to tell their story because their stories are part of my story.
Definitely.
It's our story. It's not just mine. And that's why it couldn't just be written about me. And it's the story, especially their story too, because I'm so proud of what they achieved. Because many kids who stayed out a year or two didn't go back and didn't achieve the same thing and didn't make it. They did it in spite of being locked out. In so many ways. I'm sorry that I get emotional, but stuff is still.
No.
It's still the anguish. Some of the anguish is still there. Writing the book was very cathartic.
Definitely.
I dealt with a lot of the anguish and the pain, but some of it's still there. But I'm a happy person. I have found reconciliation and inner peace and all of that. And the tears are tears of they're washing stuff away still.
Now, talk a bit. So, making the decision to come home to work at the University of Virginia, you made that decision after having received an offer to go back to your alma mater and join the faculty there. What was it about coming home to work at the flagship institution or one of the flagship institutions for Virginia?
Nice, thank you. I had signed a contract with Perea actually and then broke it. They were furious. And I had the opportunity to go to Virginia, and I thought I probably won't get tenure because they didn't give young black faculty and women tenure, and many young white ones also, until they had established a track record. But I had to go back because Virginia they had cheated me out of education. They would not have accepted me at the university as an undergraduate. They took the first undergraduates into the College of Liberal Arts in 1963. So on two strikes, they wouldn't have. Virginia had not given me an education, had deprived me of that. And the university would not accept me. It was locked out to me as well. Wouldn't accept me. And I still ordered the catalogs when I was a kid. The catalogs and thought I might apply there one day, and I knew that I couldn't. I also applied, sent for the catalogs from Cornell and all of these. I could have gone there, but it was $3,000 at the time. And the other thing was, my father had finished the third grade, and I wanted him to see my triumph. My parents, my family. I did it for them. More than, for me, but also for them. And my father only he died 6 months after I was there.
But you talk in the book about after your father passing.
Absolutely. But the thing
you learned how proud he was. And even though he might not have said it, yeah.
I will talk about that. My father was not one high on pride in talking about yourself and your accomplishments. He said, "Folks can see what you've done, and you don't need to talk about it. You're not better than anybody else." But he told all of the white farmers for whom we worked as laborers, he told them about it, and he was so proud of me. And they would, when they saw me, they said, "Your father told us you're at the University of Virginia. He's so proud of you. We're so proud of you." The pride even came through, even though none of them spoke up against the closed schools because that was the order of the day. Uh, and one of them sent his son, who was in the business school, sent him to visit me. And he came to my office and looked me up. "Professor Cobbs, my father sent me to visit you and bring greetings from him." So I had a marvelous experience at Virginia until they didn't keep me. The students were marvelous and they gave me the respect that a professor should have gotten. And it was a marvelous place to teach, but the plantation mentality was there. And white males were in charge and they let you know it. And they had a chaired professorship. They would say, "The Keenan Professor of English," and they wouldn't say Professor Robert Smith. "The Keenan Professor of English, Robert Smith." And I'm assistant professor of German, Alfred Cobbs, and they'd sometimes ask the black faculty to address the faculty about why they should have more black faculty. That was the task they shouldn't have put us through. It was unfair, and we had no clout, and it was fraught with. It had its difficulties, really, but it also had its positive moments. But I really did it because the now that the tears are gone and I'm more articulate, because Virginia had treated me out in education, and Virginia would not accept me in the undergraduate school. And I'd hoped I'd get to stay. I didn't think I'd need to leave Virginia for the third time. And so that was painful. And that's when that professor said, "I can ruin your career." When I told him I don't have to be a professor of German, then I realized in that moment I didn't. That I knew who I was, in the sense that coming back to Virginia had brought me closer to knowing who I was and coming to terms with my fate. And I didn't need them. I didn't need the University of Virginia to be successful. But I needed to work on my self image, and I needed to work on rescuing that inner being that was almost shattered at Wayne State.
What did that interaction that you have with that department chair at the University of Virginia, what did that moment do for the remainder of your career?
It certainly gave me an inner strength, and it made me understand that I had something to give. If he wanted to take my materials and give them to my colleague without my permission to use to run the program, which I had started and run successfully, it was the first time they'd had a directive basic language courses. And so I went to Wayne State with this sense of pedagogy and this know-how and all of this. The only problem was that the shoe didn't fit the foot, or that I was trying to put a round screw into a square hole. Totally different universe. And the students there were tentative, and they were first generation, and they had to work several jobs to pay tuition. And they were not kids of privilege. So they were not the privileged class. They were not, what's the term used? They were not they were not the privileged class, and they thought that I was snooty, and I was thought I was better than them, and I had too high standards, and I wasn't sympathetic in any of this. Of course, this crushed me. German was my rescue. That was my refuge, really. Somewhere in the book I talk about it wasn't about German. It was about me. So German became for me sort of my existential crutch, if you will, to survive and find my equilibrium when this bruised psyche was on ice, or it was at least lying low, uh, so that I could function. And in fact, that's what we do all the time as Black folks. When Du Bois talks about the double consciousness, how black folks operate in the world of being black and the world of white and have trouble reconciling those. I'm not suggesting mine were quite those two things. I was reconciling my two selves, my inner self and the persona that the person saw outside, and I was trying to bring them together to find my inner core, because we all, we all should have an integrated exterior and core when we are healthy people psychologically. And I didn't have that really. And racism had done that to me, had crippled me and bruised me. And I had to overcome that. I couldn't let that win. That's why it's my triumph, you know, locked out. I made it in spite of you. And that's why my editors, I say you need to put the PhD next to your name. They need to see what you've done in a PhD in German, which is considered hard. It was not easy, but I'm not the only black that's gotten a PhD in German, but it's not child's play. And I really dedicated myself to learning everything I could to be the best that I could. And I was on a Fulbright one summer, and the docent said to me, "Of all the non-Germans, your German is the best in the group, and it's the closest to the native speakers." And I was offended by that. I took umbrage and said, "Why do you say that? Is that supposed to be a compliment?" She said, "No, it's not a compliment, it's a fact." Now I had to test that with my German friends years later, and they corroborated it. What I discovered, Germans don't give, they don't give, what do I want to say? They don't give compliments like Americans. I mean, if they give you a compliment, it's for real. It's not gratuitous. So it was not a gratuitous compliment. And I gave a talk in Berlin at a conference, and I started learning German at 19, but I ended up mastering where I was had a native accent practically like a native speaker, and I'd mastered the grammar and structure system, and they couldn't understand. And they said, "How can you speak German so well? You didn't grow up in Germany, and you weren't in the military." And I said, "Well, it's a system. It's like learning math or chemistry. You master the system, you master it." They didn't want to hear it. And they kept badgering me, and I said, "My grandmother was German. I was born in 43, and my father was a GI, and he shouldn't have consorted with a German woman, but he did. And so, I have a German grandmother." And they got quiet. And they said, "Oh, okay." And they never bothered me anymore. And then in the years with my German friends, they say to me, "How do you speak German like that? How do you do that?" And I go on for days, and it's second language, it's second nature. And I had to do that to prove something. And I got the teaching award at Wayne State. And a Jewish German lady said to me, "How could you learn German so well? It was my language, and I don't learn it as well." And I said, that was condescending, I thought, and I said to her, "I think it has something to do with intelligence." And I walked away, and the vice president, Arthur Johnson, who was the vice president for community relations, said, "Good for you." I shouldn't have done that. That was unkind, but she made me annoyed because she couldn't accept that fact. Or seemed to ask me, "How could you?" It was a given. I had done it, and I had won the award for it, and she was still questioning it.
Now you talk about your experiences at Berea, getting there with the goal of really kind of working to bridge the racial divide. And this is a new world. There are new experiences, different people that you're meeting from different cultures and backgrounds. What were some of the defining moments of that experience at Berea? I know in the book you talk about your first roommate. You talk about the first time that you go home and spend the night with a white family. You talk about experiences with the Selective Service Committee in the onset of the Vietnam War. What are some of those experiences, or one of those experiences that kind of stands out to you that really defines you?
Well, I was in tears when I read the Cobb's story because they really reached out to me. They were the first folks who really reached out beyond arm's length and took me in. And these were white folks taking me in, and they invited students to their houses, but I was welcome all the time, and they just treated me like family and very kindly. So that was where I found equilibrium. That was a bright spot for me. And the other was meeting these African students who were getting independence and joining that international, the Cosmopolitan Society, going to those international dinners, learning about African countries and learning about the Middle East issue with the Arabs and the Jews and how it was problematic. And having, and Berea had, one of the things they had were those chapels. On Thursday, they canceled classes and everybody went to a secular chapel and they had a mock United Nations and a mock Republican convention, but everybody participated. They had a symposium on the European community before the common market. And they had William Sloane Coffin, who was a protester during the Vietnam War. They had Harvey Cox, who'd written a book called The Secular City, which was quite controversial. So they had controversial speakers on Sunday night. This was all intellectually very stimulating, really. And then they had Mountain Day, where we'd go out. All the faculty and students in October would go out to the mountains, and faculty would do groups and would lead groups, and they'd go at different times of the day, and student leaders would lead groups, and we'd end up a picnic lunch at the amphitheater, and that was a real sharing of experiences. That was a wonderful experience, really. And of course, I was in that philosophy class that I talk about, all white males and Alfred Cobbs. We went on a camping trip. That was a marvelous trip, except I hate camping, and that rock was hard, and the sleeping bag was awful, and the weather was cold, and getting up, taking care of nature was not my cup of tea. So I didn't. I bonded with them in the class, but they didn't become sort of permanent friends. But that certainly was a excellent course and a good experience at Berea. Uh, and then I worked at audiovisual service, but I'm technically very not very good, as you know. That's why you've been helping me through this to get me ready for this. So at audiovisual service, I did not do the projectors because I would burn. I burned once a new film. How do you, a virgin film, you burn it with a projector bulb, and it had to be spliced. And I did it in a pinch, but normally I ran the office as a student assistant, or I did the accounting. I was very good at math. I did the accounting, and it came in helpful to me when I was in Freiburg in 95, 96, when the colleague had a nervous breakdown, and I had to take care of the accounting for Wayne State because they'd have to reconcile the statements. I'd have to send all the stuff to Wayne State and reconcile the statements, and I was able to do that very easily. Uh, Working at Berea was that, and that was a group of students who worked there whom I befriended. So they became some of my friends. And the director was also very nice and friendly. All these were white folks, but they were all very cordial. And the director of the Audiovisual Center would often invite us to her house, and she took us to Lexington once, took about five of us in her car to see The Longest Day by Cornelius Ryan, and invited us to dinner and that. I mean, those kinds of faculty knew we didn't have any money and didn't have many experiences, so they reached out and did marvelous things for us, like the dinner.
Now, question. So this is kind of fast forwards a bit to your
Okay.
academic career. And it's just kind of thinking more broadly. You are a Black man that has kind of come into a profession with the German language where not a lot of Black individuals have navigated prior. You have navigated academia as a Black man. What would you say to yourself if you were entering academia at the time in which you retired? What would be some of the advice and the lessons that you would share?
Excellent.
with
Okay.
your younger self?
Always be true to yourself. Be honest. Give your best. Do what you have to do. But let nobody take your dignity or your integrity away from you. You have to fight for that above all. And then you do your work. I was a hard worker and I never shirked responsibility. So if you carry your part, folks don't look at you in terms of color, and they stop looking at me that way. And I didn't look at them in color. So I didn't feel like I was the only Black person in the room. I felt like I was one of the colleagues respected. And when I ran committees very well because my daddy had taught me when folks get to chatting about themselves, there's something wrong. And I would say to them, I think we're getting off the topic. We've got an hour to discuss this, and this is the issue. Can we come back and look at this issue? And then they would thank me for keeping it on task. And once we had a lot of work to do on general education, and I had all these proposals, and of course, professors are lazy. A lot of us don't read stuff for the committee. They come and figure, oh, I'll go and I'll vote, but I haven't. So I'd read everything carefully, take notes, and come in with notes from my colleague to say, this is some notes that I've taken. I'm not trying to influence you, but I'm trying to give you information to help you make your decision. Oh, Alfred, this is excellent. This is excellent. This is just exactly what we need. I was thinking the same thing. They weren't, of course. And then they would end up going in the direction that I suggested. So I had a lot of influence but you should stay up burning the midnight oil. Because Daddy always said, you can't be as good as they are. You have to be better.
Yeah.
And if you're not better, you get kicked to the side, really. And so I had to be better. And I had to know who I was. And I had to burn the midnight oil. And I had to never show despair. I mean, I did at when I first came to Wayne State, but not. I showed despair to that colleague who was my angel, the guy who took me to lunch and said to me, "You need to see it." But the thing is, I didn't doubt my abilities or despaired about my abilities. Even under those circumstances, my teaching was in order. I was prepared, even though I was suffering inside greatly, and I was having anguish and pain in my stomach and that. But the students never knew because you have to give your best. And then folks respected me really, and I was asked to be on all kinds of committees, and I didn't want to. They wanted uh, they wanted a Black Afro American representation, but I wasn't a token. And they realized that as soon as I got on the committee, I started asking questions, start challenging, because I thought if I'm on these committees, I have to look out for the interests of students, and particularly Black students. And I didn't say that. You can't come out and say it, but you have to start asking. And then I was on tenure and promotion. White faculty sail through. A Black faculty comes up, a white colleague will raise a question. And I knew the sympathetic colleagues. I'd raise a question and say, well, what about this? We didn't raise this about this professor. Why are we raising it about this one? Didn't use white and Black. You couldn't. And then the white colleague will pick up on that and say, yeah, Alfred is right. We need to look at this instead of this. That wouldn't be fair to this colleague. And then we'd change the tenor of the conversation. So I really had joy doing that because I really felt like I influenced a lot of stuff, which white folks didn't know because I didn't use white and Black. You couldn't do that because then you derail it because folks think you're talking in terms of race and that somebody has been a racist or been unfair. I would talk about folks being unfair, but I never talked about them being racist. I kept a level playing field. That was not easy. That was strategy, and that I had to work on. Always think about it before I got to the meeting and make notes to myself and be very deliberate in what I said and not just talk all the time, as I love to do. But at meetings, I didn't do that. I had to be deliberate. And so I navigated all of that, and in the classroom I was in charge, and they knew that, and I made sure that they know that they had to call me Professor Cobbs or Dr. Cobbs. I didn't have this thing where they first name basis and that. because they had to understand there was a difference. That I respected them, I gave them space to be themselves and to participate, but I was in charge and it was my classroom. And I was a hard taskmaster, but it was tough love, and they knew that. And they did extremely well in my classes, and they would say, "You're too tough," even after they got to like me. And they'd go to the next level and they'd said, "We are the most successful students in the class. We're the best in the class." And I said, "Are you surprised?" And they said, well, I don't know. I said, "You shouldn't be surprised. I told you this up front the first day, that what I'm doing is giving you the tools you need to succeed. I don't care what color you are. And you will succeed if you will do your part, because at the end, you will see you can do your part, and the exams don't need to be a fear. They need to be just, it's really just, it's a process you go through because you have to go through it. But you don't need to be afraid of it. You have worked your way up to there. You have come to that point. And then I would go to Germany to visit them when they'd go on a junior year program after a year. Their German was fluent, and I would invite them out to lunch or dinner. They only had 2 or 3 each time, usually no more. And I said, the price you pay is that we sit and talk German through all the meal. And I could carry on conversation in German with them like I'm carrying on one in English with you now. And that was my joy. And I said, "See, I touched you and helped you get your wings, but you did it. And I'm so proud that I helped you get there, but I didn't do it. I told you you could get there if you did this and this, and you did that. Aren't you proud of yourself?" And they would laugh, smile from ear to ear, sometimes give me a hug, and or write me a note after I left Germany thanking me for what I did for them. And I said, "But you did it. I did." That's the gift of teaching.
Well, I tell you, it's folks, as you read this book, if you have not read it yet, you will see that, in the later chapters, Dr. Cobbs shares some of the feedback received from his students who spoke about the impact that he had on them. And I think, there's no greater reward as an educator than hearing directly from those who you've had the opportunity to impact. And so it was great reading that, because you talk about, the sermon from Dr. Ross, and he speaks of the missionary who is kind of deemed this second-rate individual because, he kind of feels that he's lived this basic life. But really, when you look at your life of service to others, that is one of the biggest rewards you can give.
It absolutely is. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's part of my joy in return, is that I can bask in that. And I know it makes a difference. And they do all kinds of work. They don't all teach German. They work for, several of them have excellent jobs for Mercedes-Benz in Stuttgart, making twice what I was making at the end of my career. Several of them work for VW. Several of them work for there's several, about 200 German subsidiaries of subsidiaries of companies in Detroit. They have jobs there, but they're also lawyers and doctors. And I wrote recommendations for them because I could talk about their character and how their intellect developed and what kind of character they had, which many professors can't do. The science professors can't do that because they have 200 students and they don't know the students. I knew them intimately, and so I could write an individual recommendation for them that really reflected who they were and what they could contribute and how they had worked. And they said, they were very pleased. And I did, I did several hundred every year. I did probably 50 to 100 every year, and each one was, I had some models, but I didn't use sort of cookie cutter evaluations because that doesn't cut any ice. And I knew the students well, and I talked about them when they were slow starters. I talked about them when they were quick studies. I talked about them when they struggled, and I talked about giving them a chance, the late bloomers. And I saw all of that in them, but I talked about how they needed to be given an opportunity, and all of them that got back to me succeeded at what they wanted to do, and that's also my joy.
Now, this, Dr. Cobbs, is my final question of the evening. And it really comes from the portion of the book that you talk about reconciliation. And you talk about having been able to witness the Civil Rights Memorial in Richmond, the Light of Reconciliation here in Prince Edward County at the courthouse. Recently, we had a conversation about the Confederate statue on High Street that has been taken down as of last summer. But you also are very mindful, and I very much appreciate this, that you say, in spite of all of this progress, I am as clear-eyed as ever that racism has not disappeared from the fabric of the nation, for it is a part parcel of its DNA. But I feel positive that on that day in Prince Edward County, a group of people made at least a small tear in the fabric and decided to move forward together, beginning a new day with renewed hope and confidence. And so my question to you is that with all of the progress and the reconciliation, what does this mean in terms of how far we come? And what do you view as the work left to be done? And then what do you feel is the best way to continue to honor the courage and sacrifice of Prince Edward citizens? And that was a lot. I can repeat it.
That's a lot. That's a hard. I think we've made tremendous progress, but we've got a long ways to go. I've been reading Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste, which talks about Virginia and the caste there before the Europeans came up with the term race, and before slavery became a real institution in America. And she talks about the issues that we still have. The problems are still there, and they loom large. And they move into different. I was talking to a colleague the other day. They move into different ranges. What Wilkerson talks about, and she's done another book called The Warmth of the Suns, where she talks about migration. What's happened is that the plantations moved to the ghettos of the city, and she traces that to generations. The same folks who were mistreated in the South were mistreated up north also. They were placed in ghettos. The economic issues, the issues of housing, the issues of being discriminated against because of your color. That's where she said caste. You can't hide it. That Europeans would come over, and they come over as Irish, but when they see that the white caste makes it best, they become white. Black folks can't do that. And so we have changed, we have done veneer on this, and a few people have changed structures. But to really make a difference in this American culture, we've got to make a moral change. It has to be a change of heart, and then we have to make a structural change. The moral change has to be people have to change their heart. And the only way to do that is to rub shoulders with folks who are different. And with segregated neighborhoods still, and with segregated churches, we've still got the problem, and it looms large. You see, the reason I wrote this book, and I want my white friends and my black friends, middle class, who don't know, to understand that racism is still very much with us. And I had to put, as a professor of German, as a professor and as an Afro-American, I had to put the history stuff in there, and I struggle with where to put it. I had to talk about the Freedom Riders, and I had to talk about Reconstruction, one of the worst times in American history. And Henry Louis Gates has just done that book on Reconstruction. And the books have come out on the burning of Wilmington, North Carolina, and the city in Oklahoma, and the city in Florida, where black townships were burned and people were burned to death, and the lynching and all of that. And the professor at Ohio State who writes about the law and that, she talks about how the incarceration of blacks is a replacement of lynching, and police brutality is a replacement for lynching, so that blacks are still treated as second class citizens and not afforded their rights. So we've got a long ways to go. These are the things we have to do. It has to do with the courts changing, and that's why the Trump administration was so troubling. We need folks in government who look like all of us, and that's why I'm so pleased. So I'm pleased, but very cautious about President Biden appointing all kinds of folks in the cabinet to the cabinet. They can only do so much as the public allows. People have to be open, and what we have in America is a deeply divided society, and so the racism is very much there. What we saw at the Capitol and in Charlottesville were those vigilantes. They were people just like the folks in the Confederacy who burned towns and that. So we are back where we were with a few cosmetic changes and a few changes of heart. But if we don't make the structural changes which slaps racism in the face, and if we don't make the moral changes which says I have to accept every human being as equal to me, regardless. And so we can't hold things against immigrants. We can't hold things against Arabs. We can't hold things against people of color of any kind, transgender people, women. You see, all of these things are still problems. And we have scratched at the surface. And that's why I talked about tearing the fabric. We need to tear the fabric asunder. And ironically, the covert virus has shown us in great relief the disparities, and I'm afraid we're not doing enough about that. I mean, some folks are, and some folks are saying, well, what do you expect? We can't just give folks money, and we just can't do this. And so the folks are balking at making the difference. And so I'm very guarded in my perspective. My life is good, and I've surrounded myself with people of all color and all nationalities and that, and hold no prejudice and accept people for who they are. But I'm one person, and everybody I touch, I try to convince them that. And I've tried to use my life as an instrument for reconciliation, as a bridge to reconciliation, as a bridge to peace, because I think that's the only way we do it. And so Joni, my editor, said to me, your book has no bitterness. And I didn't want bitterness to be there because bitterness is self destructive. And I don't need to do anything to destroy myself or to make things worse. And so everywhere that I am, I've built bridges, and I'm convinced that the people I have touched, the white students I have touched, and my friends in Germany and my friends in America, do not see me in terms of color. They see me in terms of their friend and their professor. And I'm so pleased that my life has built those bridges and helped them to see that, really. And that's because I've accepted them as they are, and I've not made excuses for who I am and where I come from. And I will not be, my dignity will not be taken away, my integrity and my personhood will not be insulted. If that's the case, I walk away then. Uh, and I don't get ugly. I've learned that too. You don't get ugly, you walk away, because you get ugly in racism. What you have is two ugly people doing ugly things to one another, and it breeds contempt and hate, and we have too much of that in the world. Uh, so that as a professor, I have tried to use my life also as an instrument to reach people and to make a difference in the world. And I hope and pray that I have. And and that's where I am. I could go on, but you might want to make some closing remarks.
Well, no, my friend, you have certainly touched and blessed me tonight with all that you have shared. And again, folks, if you have not had the opportunity to purchase and read this memoir, Locked Out, Finding Freedom and Education After Prince Edward County Closed Its Schools, I certainly encourage you to do so. It will touch your heart in so many ways. And again, Dr. Cobbs, we are so grateful for you joining us tonight.
You're very welcome. I'd like to say to all of my viewers, if you've read the book already, and many of you have, please reread it looking for the two voices, because you will find my elusive voice. My elusive voice, the voice that's sometimes elusive, the voice that's sometimes strained, the voice that's sometimes muted, the voice that's sometimes joyous, the voice that's sometimes sad. That's all embedded in the book. And if you read it for the surface and for my story looking for me, you have missed half of the book. What's unsaid, if you read between the lines and you think about race relations, it's in the book. That's why I said to you, if I were to write my memoir now, I could talk about those things. I couldn't even give a speech about Prince Edward when I was at Berea. It was too painful. It was the gaping wound that I talked about. And so those who are not familiar with the civil rights history that I've put in there, you need to go to other sources, and I have footnotes. But I really wanted that to be there for folks unschooled in that to understand what this has done to Black folks. And these are scars we carry for life. And these are psychic scars. And so my book really talks about psychic scars. And the only balm for psychic scars is reconciliation, inner peace, and serenity. And I found those. So I found the balm for my scars.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And so, folks, I do ask that you continue to visit motonmuseum.org. You can stay up to date with all of our public programs, which we will continue to deploy virtually during 2021 as we navigate the pandemic that we are still in. Please mark your calendars. March 18th, we will hold our Dr. C.G. Gordon Moss lecture featuring Dr. Duana Waugh, Assistant Professor of History from Sweetbriar College, as she gives a talk titled Fighting Back, Forging Ahead, How Race and Power Shape the Collective Memory of Black Student Protests in Prince Edward County on the March the 18th at 7 p.m. And then in April, on the 23rd, which is the 70th anniversary of the student walkout, we will hold our event called Moton Live. Moton Live will be an opportunity for us to commemorate history and pledge to the future with a 10-hour virtual celebration and dialogue. And so I want you to be a part of this massive virtual event and fundraiser as we seek to raise support for the museum and our operations, education, and outreach initiatives. And again, thank you all for joining us this evening. This program will remain housed at youtube.com/Moton Museum and facebook.com/Moton Museum. Thank you all.